Thanks, Will. And to start the interview, would you like to make a few comments about your early life?
Sure, by way of background. I, until I was 14, lived in Brisbane. Then my dad, we had a farm. It had been run by a share farmer, and my dad took it over in '67 when I was 14. So that got me deeply involved in and very interested in agriculture. So when I started to think about what to study at University of Queensland, agriculture was my first choice, and that's where everything got started. That period, when I was an undergraduate from 71 to 74, was a really interesting period. I'm sure you remember the enormous price spike. I mean, much bigger than the recent one we had in 2008 and 11. Commodity prices went absolutely through the roof, but for a short time. So it became very clear to me that commodity prices mattered a whole lot. The other thing that was important, we had a dairy farm, was the trade policy change. The UK did what wasn't at the time called Brentference, but might have been, and joined the European community. Now, that had implications for a number of Australian agricultural products, including dairy products, because that market for manufactured milk disappeared and put additional pressure on an already struggling Queensland dairy industry. Basically we moved out, and the whole area where we had a farm between Beaudesert and Canungra, that whole area before very long moved out of dairy farming. So this episode gave me a very heightened awareness that trade policy changes on the other side of the world can impact you very, very directly, and that got me interested in agricultural trade issues.
Your first degree was in agricultural science from the University of Queensland?
Yes,
Would you like
yes.
to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So the agricultural science program had a degree of specialisation within it. I started out mainly interested in the science side of it, but increasingly found that the economic issues, the economic courses were much more, engaged my attention and interest much more. And John Longworth, who was the head of that unit, encouraged me to move in that direction. So I did the agricultural economics minor, or major, I suppose it was called. Although when I got to the then Bureau of Agricultural Economics, I realised that I didn't have enough depth in economics. That most of agricultural economics was primarily about the economics, so that's what you really needed to know. It was useful sometimes to have a bit of practical knowledge about what fertilizers were for and so on. But the core thing you needed was economics. So that led me to do some more economics at the Australian National University. So I would have lectures. The BAE was based in where I was in Lonsdale Street in Canberra, which, and it's now, I noticed, just moved to the next street, a block away, Mort Street. So, but I used to hop on my bike and ride over to ANU for lectures, and that I found really helped strengthen my preparation. Then after about 4.5 years, my wife and I went to Iowa State University to study for me to study agricultural economics. And my wife Chris, her interest was in English And at the time she was particularly interested in some of the new literature coming out of Africa and the South Pacific. So you had authors like Wallace Inca writing and going on to win Nobel Prizes for that literature. But she found two scholars at Iowa State who were very interested and in a position to supervise her studies there. And the other thing, of course, is that Iowa State helped us make the decision about where to go, because they offered us financial support. So we headed off to Ames, Iowa, for 3 very enjoyable years.
Who were some of the academic staff that you interacted with at Iowa?
Oh, well, I had the good fortune to be supervised by Earl Heady, who was one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest, of the agricultural economists of his generation. He had a very famous blue book. He'd also done a lot of work with one of his graduate students, John Dillon, who went on to head the Ag Econ program at University of New England, and who came back to Iowa State while we were there, to receive a distinguished graduate award. And then you had Carl Fox, whose work was really innovative and interesting work on quantitative economic policy, for instance. Harvey Lepin on microeconomics, Dennis Starleaf on the macro side. Very, very good, gave me a good rounded graduate education. It was a single department, economics and agricultural economics, with a lot of strength on the Ag Econ side, but it also required us to study very broadly, to study macroeconomics, for instance, which some schools, I think, mistakenly allow agricultural economists not to really learn about. But that macroeconomic background, for instance, was enormously useful in the last couple of months as I prepared my presidential address for this conference.
Okay.